Welcome back. Well, there's been what appears to be almost economic chaos on the markets involving the British pound. Britain's new finance minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, delivered a mini-budget featuring several tax cuts. The tax cuts only appear to benefit the rich, but investors are now punishing the pound. The British government is facing several issues, including very high inflation and rising energy costs. We now speak to Professor Adrian Saville from Genera Capital. Professor Saville, good evening to you. There's been a huge run on the pound. For possibly the first time in history, we've seen the pound at very close to parity with the US dollar. That's how weak it's become. What's created this situation?
Well, the US dollar, Stephen, also needs to be given some light in the show. If you look at the performance of the US dollar against currencies across the board, the dollar has had a strong period in performing against all major currencies, not just sterling. So, in thinking about currencies, it's always important to remember that it's being compared to something else. So we shouldn't always, translate a currency weakness as the currency, sterling, for instance, weakening. But in this case, I think you're absolutely, on the money in highlighting the concerns that have been put around the performance of sterling against the dollar and, many other major and lesser currencies. Although a lot of the market reaction seems to be that this is a monetary phenomenon, i.e., they're putting it down to rampant UK inflation, the fact that the Bank of England has raised interest rates, is a little behind the curve in central bank language, and has even spoken about a surprise or in other language shock hike between meetings. It's very hard to mistake that this is actually not a monetary issue, that what's really going on here is real concerns about fiscal action, about the recently announced budget.
The only comparable event that I could think of in our recent history, so since 1994, was probably the firing of Nene as finance minister by then President Zuma in 2015. Is this sort of similar? There was a huge financial reaction to that. We're seeing a huge financial reaction to this. In other words, investors are saying to the British government, we don't like what you're doing and you're doing the wrong thing.
Well, the British government is on the horns of a dilemma here also, because they're trying to walk a very, very fine fiscal or budget line. In one breath, they're trying to appease taxpayers, in other words, voters, who have expressed growing dissatisfaction and disillusionment with the government of the day. Liz Truss has come in and with her chancellor have announced a range of budgetary actions that have been met with even more displeasure than was the case ahead of her election or appointment. And at the same time, there is a very large deficit now that needs to be funded, which means the Treasury needs to be speaking to capital markets and asking capital markets to stay on their side. And I think that's where the big convulsion has come, is, capital markets have simply said, we don't like the look of this, we don't like the smell of this, and we're not going to fund you at the rates that, you've been funded recently. And so you've seen the bond market absolutely leap out of bed. There's a lovely throwaway line that James Carville says, in my next life, I'm coming back as the bond market because you can intimidate everyone. And that's exactly what the bond market has done. Although a lot of attention is on currency and equity markets, I think the real action is going on in the bond market. And it's suggesting that the British government budget is not fundable in this shape and form at these levels. And that, in turn, has potentially dramatic knock-on effects, because it starts to spill into mortgage rates.
So all of this is going to have a huge impact on British people. We talk about energy costs. For us, that's usually fuel. It has an impact on things like food prices. But for them, it has an impact actually on staying alive, simply because it's so cold as they go into their winter. Are there any ways out of this for the British government and for their central bank, the Bank of England?
Well, Stephen, you said earlier you don't remember recent events. Perhaps just to flag two that were of similar magnitude. The one was the Brexit sell-off in currency, where you had that 10% move overnight. That was a couple of years back. And then we need to go all the way back to the 1980s, where sterling fell out of the euro snake, or the euro tunnel. And that was a shock of similar proportion. Now, both of those required, in response, structural policy reforms, not interest rate action, but rather changing the nature and the structure of the economy. Unfortunately, in recent times, the way that it's gone in the case of the UK is those structural reforms have gone in the exact opposite direction. And interestingly, in a number of meetings we've had in the UK recently, the Genera capital investment team, this has been exactly the concern, is on the dysfunctional structure of the economy, and that's, I think, the elephant in the room is Brexit.
Professor Adrian Saville, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time.